Marlo Coleman was 14 years old the night she learned how quickly the word family could turn into something hollow. The house on the edge of town had never felt like home. Not really. It was a narrow aging place with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged just enough to remind you it was tired of standing. For almost 2 years, it had been the closest thing Marlo had to shelter after her mother and father were gone. Not warmth, not love, just shelter. And on this October night, even that was about to be taken from her. The air inside the house felt heavier than usual that evening. The television murmured in the corner. Some game show. No one was watching the canned laughter, rising and falling like a tide that never reached the shore. The smell of reheated supper hung in the kitchen, sour and faintly burned. Marlo stood near the mouth of the hallway, with her backpack already zipped tight against her spine, her hands clenched so hard the knuckles had gone the color of bone. Her aunt did not raise her voice. Somehow, that made it worse. "You can't stay here anymore," Carol said. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere past Marlo's shoulder, as though looking the girl in the face would cost her something she was not willing to pay. "We've done what we could." Marlo swallowed. She had rehearsed 100 answers in the long quiet of her room, promises to work harder, to eat less, to stay out of the way, to make herself smaller and quieter and easier to forget. But when the moment finally came, none of those careful words made it past the knot in her throat. "I'll sleep in the garage," she said at last, and her voice cracked down the middle thin and ashamed of itself. "Or the basement. I won't be any trouble. You won't even know I'm here." Her uncle sighed from his chair. It was the sound a man makes when he feels inconvenience rather than cruel, which is its own particular kind of cruelty. Roy did not look up from the television. "This isn't up for debate, Marlo. You're old enough to figure things out." Old enough. The words landed harder than the door that came after them. 10 minutes later, she stood on the front porch with the backpack slung over one shoulder, the strap already biting into her collarbone. The porch light clicked off behind her without ceremony, as though the house itself had decided she was no longer worth illuminating. The door closed. The deadbolt turned. The sound was small and final and absolute, the sound of a chapter ending, whether the reader was ready or not. The October night wrapped around her sharp and cold and indifferent. A thin wind scraped through the bare branches of the trees that lined the street. Somewhere down the block, a screen door banged once and went still. Marlo stayed where she was for a long moment, staring at the closed door, half expecting it to open again, half expecting Carol to call her back inside with some grudging change of heart. It did not open. No one called. So she walked. At first, she did not know where she was going. She followed the sidewalk out of pure habit, past houses glowing with warm yellow light, past curtains drawn tight against the chill. Each lit window felt like a small private world she no longer had any claim to. A family bent over a dinner table, a woman laughing at something off to the side, a man calling up the stairs for a child to come wash before the food got cold. Marlo kept her head down and her eyes on the cracked pavement, and she walked. She thought as she went of how strange it was that a person could live in a town her whole life and still pass through it like a ghost seen by no one, claimed by no one, belonging to nothing but the cold air she moved through. By the time she reached the edge of town, her legs ached and her chest felt strangely hollow, as though something important had been scooped out and left behind on that porch. She came to a wooden bench near the shuttered feed store, and she let the backpack slide off her shoulder, and she sat. Inside that backpack was the whole of her life now. 3 shirts, 1 spare pair of jeans, a toothbrush, a folded photograph of her parents that she never let anyone see, and a small wad of bills wrapped in a brittle rubber band. $5. She counted it anyway, once, then again, as though the number might somehow grow if she stared at it hard enough in the dark. It did not. $5 was $5, and it was every cent that stood between her and nothing at all. The town was quiet in the way small towns get quiet at night, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound enormous. The distant hum of the highway, the creak of the old bench beneath her, the unsteady rhythm of her own breathing. She thought about her mother and father, then not in the grand and tragic way people imagine grief, but in fragments that arrived without permission. Her father's laugh, loud and unguarded, the kind that made strangers smile in line at the grocery store. Her mother's hands resting on her shoulders when she thought Marlowe was not paying attention, warm and sure and steady. The way they used to say, even when the money was thin and the bills were stacked in their unopened envelopes on the counter, "We'll figure it out." They had always figured it out, the two of them, right up until the night the road took them, and figured nothing out ever again. Marlowe wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie and made herself stand up. Sitting still felt too much like giving up, and she was not ready to give up. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if she could help it. The next morning came gray and unforgiving. She had slept curled behind the feed store with the backpack for a pillow, waking every hour as the cold worked its way deeper into her bones. When the sun finally rose, it brought no warmth, only a thin clarity that settled over her like frost. She could not keep living this way. She knew that the way you know the cold in your teeth and your fingertips and the marrow of you. That was when she saw the paper. It was taped crookedly to the bulletin board outside the courthouse, fluttering at one corner where the tape had given up. Most people walked past it without slowing. Marlowe did not. Something in the shape of the words pulled her closer, and she stood squinting at the faded print in the early light. County auction. Unclaimed property. The list beneath was short and unremarkable. Old farm equipment. A parcel of scrubland nobody wanted. And there, almost as an afterthought at the very bottom, in letters that seemed to have been added in a hurry, "Abandoned house outskirts of town. Minimum bid $5. Marlowe's heart gave a single hard knock against her ribs. She knew the house. Everyone in town knew the house. It sat miles out past the last paved road, a weather-beaten ruin that the older folks called the dead house, and the younger ones simply called that old wreck. Children dared each other to walk up to its sagging porch in the long days of summer, and then ran screaming back to their bicycles. Grown men spoke of it the way they spoke of a bad memory, in lowered voices, eyes sliding away. She had heard all the stories, that a man had frozen to death inside it one winter long ago, that the roof had caved, that the place was cursed and worthless and best left to rot back into the prairie that had birthed it. $5. Marlowe looked down at the crumpled bills in her hand, then back up at the paper. A strange calm settled over her, quiet and deliberate, the kind of calm that has nothing to do with peace. She did not feel brave. She did not even feel hopeful. What she felt standing alone in the gray morning with everything she owned on her back was decided. A cursed house was still a house. A roof that had caved in one place was still a roof in all the others. And a place that frightened grown men was a place that no grown man would come to take from her. The auction itself was a small and awkward affair held in a drafty room at the back of the courthouse that smelled of dust and old varnish. A handful of farmers leaned against the walls with their hands buried in their coat pockets, their more out of habit than any real intention to buy. The county clerk read the items off in a flat and bored voice, and the bids came and went without much interest from anyone. When he reached the last item on the list, the room went oddly still. $5, the clerk said, peering down through his glasses. Do I have a bid on the property at the end of County Road? One abandoned residence. $5 to open. No one spoke. A farmer near the window shifted his weight. Somewhere a radiator ticked. Marlowe raised her hand. A couple of the men chuckled, not unkindly, but with that soft disbelief that grown people reserve for a child who does not yet understand how the world works. She felt the heat climb her neck, but she did not lower her hand. $5, she said, and this time she said it louder, so it would carry across the quiet room, and there could be no mistaking it. The clerk glanced up, surprised his pen hovering over the page. He looked at her for a moment, this thin girl in a worn hoodie with a backpack at her feet, and then he shrugged, the way men shrug when they have decided something is no longer their problem. "Any other bids?" he asked the room. Silence answered him. "Sold." The gavel came down with a single dull and final crack, and the sound of it would stay with Marlowe for the rest of her life. She walked to the front of the room and signed her name on the deed with a borrowed pen, her handwriting uneven but pressed hard into the paper as though she meant to leave a mark that could not be erased. And here is the thing that nobody in that room could have known. As Marlowe straightened up with the folded deed in her hand, she was not just a homeless girl who had spent her last $5 on a ruin. She was the only person in the entire county who had ever been willing to say yes to that house. Every farmer in that room had the money in his pocket. Every one of them had passed it by that year and every year before it. The dead house had sat unwanted on that auction list, season after season read aloud and met with the same embarrassed silence until a 14-year-old girl with nothing left to lose raised her hand. The thing the whole town had agreed to throw away had found the one person desperate enough, or perhaps brave enough, to claim it. And in claiming it, she had claimed something the others could not see in all that rot and ruin, a beginning. When she stepped back out onto the courthouse steps, with the deed folded carefully into the pocket of her jeans, the sky seemed brighter than it had in days. She did not know the first thing about fixing a house. She did not know how she would survive the winter that was already breathing down the back of her neck. But for the first time in 2 long years, Marlowe Coleman owned something. It was hers, and that single fact was enough to carry her to the next step and the next and the one after that. The walk out to the house took the better part of the afternoon. She followed a dirt road that narrowed into 2 thin ruts, cutting through fields already turning brown with the dying of the year. The town fell away behind her faster than she expected, the houses thinning and then vanishing altogether, replaced by wide open land and a sky that felt far too large for a 14-year-old girl carrying everything she owned on her back. With every step, the doubt crept closer. She heard again the soft laughter from the auction room, saw again the way those men had looked at her, not with malice, but with something almost worse, a kind of gentle pity, the look you give a child trying to lift a weight that will only crush her. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had just thrown away her last $5 on a pile of rotten wood at the end of the world. By the time the house came into view, the sun hung low and sharp, throwing long shadows across the prairie grass. From a distance, it barely looked like a house at all, just a slumped and broken shape against the land hunched over, like an old man who had finally given up trying to stand straight. Up close, it was worse than the stories. It was an old log structure, the heavy timber walls gone gray and silver with the years, and where the logs ran out, the builder had finished it in plank siding that now hung loose and rattling in the wind. The roof sagged inward, and along one side, a whole section of shingles and rafters had collapsed entirely, leaving the bones of it open to the sky like the ribs of something long dead. The windows were empty holes, dark and hollow like the gaps left by missing teeth. The front door leaned drunkenly on a single hinge and scraped against the frame when Marlowe pushed it open. Cold air rushed out to meet her, and with it a smell that stopped her where she stood. Damp wood and old dust, and underneath it all something faintly sour, as though time itself had crawled in here to rot. The floor was a patchwork of bare dirt and warped planks. Dead leaves had blown in through the broken places and piled in the corners. Something stirred in the rafters overhead, a loose board shifting in a draft, and went still. This was it. This was what $5 bought. Marlo stood in the doorway for a long moment, the backpack still on her shoulders, her heart pounding against her ribs, and then, because there was nothing else to do, she stepped inside. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls and cut straight through her hoodie as though it were not there at all. Late light slanted down through the holes in the roof and lit the floating dust like 1,000 tiny sparks suspended in the cold air. There was no furniture, no warmth, no comfort of any kind, and yet, standing there in the ruin of it, Marlo noticed something she had not expected. It was quiet, not the empty, accusing quiet of being shut out on a porch in the dark. This was a different quiet, an open and waiting kind, the quiet of a place that had been forgotten for so long it had stopped expecting anyone to come. She walked the perimeter, slowly counting her steps without realizing she was doing it. The house was small, just one main room, not much bigger than a box, with a narrow section toward the back that might once have been a place to sleep. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against one of the heavy logs that formed the wall. The timber was rough and splintered under her hand, gray with age, but beneath the rot of the surface, she could feel something solid. Not all of it was ruin. Some of it, the bones of it, still held. The walls themselves, the great old logs at the base, were sound. It was the roof and the siding and the broken places that had failed, and those, she thought, those a person might be able to mend. She lowered herself down hard onto a half-collapsed crate against the wall and let out a long breath. She felt as though she had been holding since the night before. Her chest ached. Her hands would not stop shaking, whether from the cold or the fear she could no longer tell. She drew the folded deed from her pocket and smoothed it flat against her knee, and she read her own name where she had pressed it into the page. Marlo Coleman. For the first time in her short and difficult life, something official, something stamped and signed and recorded in a county ledger said that she belonged somewhere. That night she slept inside the house, not because it was warm, it was not, but because the thought of sleeping out under the open sky again felt somehow worse than the cold inside these broken walls. She wedged the leaning door shut as best she could with a snapped length of plank, spread her jacket over the driest patch of dirt she could find, and curled around her backpack with it clutched to her chest like the last warm thing in the world. Every small sound jolted her back from the edge of sleep, the wind whirring at the loose boards, the shifting and settling of old timber, the far-off howl of the wind itself moving across the empty prairie. The cold seeped up through the ground and into her bones until her teeth chattered and she could not make them stop. At one point in the deepest part of the night, she sat up, hugging her knees to her chest, and whispered into the dark, "You can do this." She did not fully believe it, but she said it anyway, and saying it helped the way her parents' old words had once helped, and she lay back down and waited for morning. Morning brought light but no warmth. Frost coated the ground outside and turned the dead prairie grass silver in the early sun. Marlo stepped out and stamped her feet and breathed great clouds of fog into the brittle air. Her stomach growled with a sharpness that bent her almost double. The $5 were gone now, spent on the deed in her pocket, and food had become a problem with no easy answer. She would have to go back into town, not to beg. She was not ready for that, and some stubborn thing in her hoped she never would be. She would go to look for work. That day she cleaned out a cluttered shed for an elderly man who paid her in coins and a wary nod. She hauled crates of empty bottles behind a diner and was given a lukewarm sandwich that she ate too fast, standing in the alley, ashamed of her own hunger. People noticed her now, not in any dramatic way, just in small glances and quieter murmurs as she passed. "That's the girl who bought the old place. That's the one. Did you hear?" By late afternoon, cold to the center of her, she pushed open the door of the hardware store, more to escape the wind than out of any real plan. A bell jingled above the door, and the smell of cut wood and machine oil and cold metal wrapped around her like something almost like comfort. The man behind the counter looked up. He was broad in the shoulders, with gray hair and a face weathered by years, and eyes that were sharp despite the tiredness in them. "You're the girl," he said. It was not a question, and it was not unkind. Marlowe stiffened where she stood. Here it comes, she thought. The lecture, or the laugh, or the pity. The house? The man continued watching her. The $5 house. She nodded, bracing herself. The man studied her for a long second, the way a person studies a tool he is not sure he trusts. "Name's Walt Hendricks," he said finally. "I run this place. You planning on fixing that wreck?" "Yes, sir," she said. Walt let out a short breath through his nose that was almost a laugh. "That house killed a man once. You know that." "So did the cold," Marlowe said before she could stop herself. Her face went hot the instant the words were out, but she lifted her chin and did not look away. "I won't let it do it again." Walt did not smile, but something moved behind his eyes, some small recalculation, not quite approval, but something in its neighborhood. "You got a plan?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head because lying to this man seemed pointless. "I've got time," she said, "and I can work." He leaned back against the shelves behind him and crossed his arms over his chest. "Winter's coming early this year, earlier than most." "I know." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the tick of the register and the wind pressing at the windows. And then Walt Hendricks did something that Marlowe would turn over in her mind many times in the weeks to come. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small box of bent and rusted nails and a coil of rough twine, and he set them down on the worn wood in front of her. "Scrap," he said. "Junk I've been meaning to throw out. You can have it." He paused, then reached back under and added a short length of stovepipe, dented but whole. "That too. You're going to want a way to let the smoke out without burning the place down around your ears. Cut a hole high in the roof, run that through it, pack the gap with clay, if you can find any. A fire on an open floor in a closed house will kill you quicker than the cold will, and quieter." Marlowe stared at the box and the pipe. "I don't have any money." "Didn't ask for any." She swallowed against something tight in her throat. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Walt's voice was flat and even, but his eyes held hers. "If you're still alive come spring, then we'll talk." She gathered the box and the twine and the length of pipe into her arms and stepped back out into the cold with the bell jingling behind her, and she did not understand until much later what he had really handed her that afternoon. It was not the nails, it was not the pipe, it was the first thing anyone had given her in 2 long years that did not come wrapped in resentment. It was a door left open, just a crack, and on the long walk back, out to the house in the gathering dark with the wind at her back and the box of bent nails held tight against her chest, Marlowe found that she was not crying and she was not afraid, and for one strange moment she was something close to hopeful. Back at the house she got to work that very evening while the last of the light still held. She started small because small was all she knew how to do. She dragged the worst of the rotten boards out through the leaning door and stacked the dead leaves into a corner and sorted what little might still be useful from what was beyond saving. She built a rough ring of stones from a dry creek bed for a fire and cut a hole high in the sound part of the roof and fit Walt's stovepipe through it the way he had told her, packing the gap as best she could against the weather. Her hands blistered fast against the rough wood. Dirt worked itself deep under her nails. She worked until her shoulders burned and her legs trembled beneath her, and the dark made it impossible to see what she was doing. Then she stepped back and looked at what she had done. It was not much. By any measure, it was almost nothing at all. But the space felt different now, less like a grave, more like a beginning that had not yet decided what it would become. That night, for the first time, she lit a small fire in the stone ring and watched the smoke find its way up and out through the pipe instead of gathering under the roof, and she warmed her hands at a flame that was hers in a house that was hers, and she slept a little. For the first time since the night she had been put out, Marlowe Coleman did not feel invisible. She had a house. It was broken and forgotten and condemned by an entire town, exactly the way she felt herself to be. And somehow, impossibly, that was the very thing that made it hers. She did not yet know how close the house would come to killing her before the winter was through. She did not know about the board that would fall in the dark, or the storms that would test every nail she drove, or the night a light would appear in the snow and change everything she believed about what a broken place was worth. She knew only this: she had said yes when the whole world had said no, and in the cold and the dark at the end of that dirt road, with frost gathering on the inside of the walls, and her breath rising in pale clouds toward the wounded roof, that single yes was the warmest thing she owned. The first real test was still weeks away, but the cold was already counting the days, and so in her own quiet and stubborn way was she. The cold came faster than Marlowe had expected. By the second week, the mornings greeted her with stiff fingers and breath that hung white in the air, even inside the walls. Frost crept along the inside of the logs in delicate spreading patterns, beautiful in a way that frightened her, because she understood now that beauty out here was only the cold, showing you how close it had come in the night. Every evening, the wind rose and tested the structure, slipping through the cracks, rattling the loose boards, reminding her over and over how thin the line was between shelter and exposure, between a girl who survived the night and a girl who did not. The house did not welcome her. It challenged her. She learned that quickly, the way you learn the temperament of something that could kill you. One night, a sudden gust tore a half-rotted board loose from the roof, and it came down with a sharp crack and struck the dirt floor, not a foot from where her head had lain only moments before. She had risen to feed the small fire, and that one accident of timing was the only reason she was alive to feel her heart slam against her ribs. She sat frozen afterwards, staring up at the new wound in the roof where the stars blinked coldly down through the gap. If she had been asleep, if she had not risen when she did not let herself finish the thought. She wrapped her arms around her knees and breathed until the shaking passed, and somewhere in that long stillness, a decision hardened inside her. If the house was going to stand, she would have to tear part of it down before she could build it back up. The rot had to come out. The weak had to be cut away from the strong, or the weak would bring the whole of it down on top of her one night while she slept. Demolition was nothing like the movies had led her to believe. There was no drama in it, no triumphant swing of a hammer. It was slow and exhausting and unforgiving. She pried at the warped boards with the crowbar Walt had let her borrow, and the rotten wood crumbled in her hands, while the good wood fought her for every nail. She climbed carefully along the weakened frame, testing each beam before she trusted it with her weight, learning to read the difference between wood that would hold and wood that only pretended to. More than once she slipped and came down hard, the breath knocked clean out of her lungs, lying in the dirt and the splinters until she could draw air again. No one saw that part. From the road, the house only looked worse, and that was exactly how the town read it. They began stopping again, those townspeople. They came on the pretense of checking a fence line or surveying a field, but their eyes always found the house. They watched from a distance with their coats pulled tight and their heads shaking slowly. "She's tearing it down now," one man muttered. To another one gray afternoon, the words carrying farther on the cold air than he knew. "Told you," the other answered. "Won't make it a month." Marlowe heard them. She always heard them. She just never gave them the satisfaction of an answer. She bent back to the board she was pulling and let them talk, because talk was cheap and warmth was not, and she had no time to spend on either their doubt or her own pride. Her days fell into a brutal and narrowing rhythm. She woke cold. She worked until her hands burned and split. She stopped only when the light failed, and she could no longer see the wood in front of her. She ate whatever the day's odd jobs in town had earned her, which some nights was nothing more than bread, softened in water to make it go further. Then she slept, wrapped in her jacket, with her body aching too deeply to care about anything but the dark behind her eyes. The house pushed back against her at every turn. A beam split without warning. A rusted nail tore her palm open, and she watched her own blood drip dark against the pale wood, and then she wrapped the hand in a strip of cloth and kept working because stopping was a luxury she could not afford. Some nights when the work was done and the fire had burned low, she would take the folded photograph from the bottom of her backpack and hold it close to the light. Her mother and father looked back at her younger than she remembered them, squinting into a summer sun that did not exist anymore. "We'll figure it out," she could almost hear her father say. She traced the worn crease that ran across the picture where she had folded and unfolded it 1,000 times, and she put it away again before her hands could shake too badly, and she lay down, and in the morning she went back to work. That was the only answer she had to the cold and the doubt and the great hollow ache of missing them. You went back to work. One afternoon, the exhaustion finally caught her, and she sank down against the wall with her head dropping forward, and for one long and terrible moment, she thought about leaving, just walking back down that dirt road and never coming back. The thought frightened her more than the falling board, had more than the cold, more than the hunger. She pressed her forehead against the rough log and breathed slowly until the thought loosened its grip and let her go. "Not quitting," she muttered to the empty house. The words came out flat and stubborn, less a feeling than a decision. Not this. What Marlowe did not know was that the town had begun to talk about her differently, not kindly, not yet, but more quietly, with less laughter in it. Walt Hendricks drove out one afternoon under the thin excuse of delivering feed to a farm farther down the road, and he did not stop at first. He only slowed his truck and watched through the windshield as she wrestled a salvage beam into place entirely alone, her jaw set, her breath steady, despite the strain of a load that should have been too heavy for her. She did not call out for help. That was not coming. She did not look around to see if anyone was watching. That roof should have come down on her weeks ago, Walt thought, and he found he could not quite look away from the sight of a 14-year-old girl refusing to let it. He came back a week later, and this time he pulled the truck right up in front of the house. Marlowe looked up from the wood she was splitting, startled, and wiped the sweat and grime from her face with her sleeve, suddenly and painfully aware of how small and ragged she must look, thin and dirty, in the same jacket she had worn for weeks. Walt stepped down from the cab and walked the perimeter of the structure in silence, his eyes moving over her work. "You reinforced the west wall," he said at last. She nodded. "Wind hits hardest there." He raised an eyebrow at her. "You teach yourself that." "Just watched," she said, and guessed. Walt moved slowly around the building, testing the joints with the toe of his boot, examining the rough notches where she had fit new wood against old. He stopped at a corner where a fresh board met an ancient one. "These cuts are tight," he said, and there was something almost grudging in it. "Tighter than what was here before." She waited, not certain whether that was praise or warning. Walt exhaled and looked off toward the dying light at the edge of the field. "My father was a carpenter," he said. "Taught me a few things when I was about your age." He glanced back at her. He'd have approved of this. The words landed heavier than the man could have intended. Marlowe swallowed hard and said nothing, because there was nothing in her that could have answered without breaking. Walt opened the back of his truck and lifted out a bundle wrapped in stiff canvas, tar paper, a sack of nails that had not been bent and rusted, materials worth real money. "Been sitting in storage," he said, "doing nobody any good." "I can't," Marlowe started. "Didn't say free." He paused, and then his voice came softer than she had heard it. "Didn't say now either." She met his eyes. "I'll pay you back, every cent of it." "I believe you," Walt said, and the simple fact that he said it, that a grown man had looked at her and said the words, "I believe you," and meant them, undid something in her chest that the cold and the hunger and the falling board had not been able to touch. That night, she worked by lantern light until her fingers went numb, laying the tar paper in careful overlapping rows, sealing the gaps where the wind had been getting in, doing everything she could against the next storm she knew was coming. The house still was not warm, but for the first time it felt as though it were fighting alongside her instead of against her. The first real snow came early in November, a wet and heavy fall that coated the whole world in a white and ringing silence. Marlowe stood outside in the gray morning and watched it come down, and a fear tightened in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was the test, not the wind, not the cold nights, not the falling board. The snow would pile against the walls and press down on the roof with a weight that did not care how hard she had worked, and the house would either hold or it would not. It held. The patched sections did not give. The roof sagged under the burden of the snow, groaning like a living thing, but it stayed where she had nailed it. That night she sat close to her fire ring, feeding it carefully, rationing the warmth log by precious log, and as she stared into the flames, a feeling settled over her that she had not felt in longer than she could remember. It was pride, not the loud kind that needs an audience, the quiet kind, the earned kind. She had built something with her own ruined hands, and it had held against the first thing the winter had thrown at it. She survived that night, and then she survived another, and another after that. But the winter was not the only thing that came for her that month. It was a cold and overcast afternoon when the car she did not recognize came rolling up the dirt road, moving slow over the frozen ruts. Marlowe straightened from her work and watched it approach with a wariness that had become second nature, and then her stomach dropped because she did recognize it after all. She knew the dent in the front fender. She knew the two figures who climbed out into the cold and stood looking at her across the frozen yard, Carol and Roy. For a long moment no one spoke. Her aunt's eyes moved over the house, over the patch walls and the salvage windows and the thread of smoke rising steady from the stovepipe, and something flickered across Carol's face that Marlowe could not quite read. Surprise. And underneath the surprise, something that looked almost like shame. "We've been hearing things," Carol said. Finally, her arms crossed the same way they had been crossed on the night she put the girl out the door. "In town, people talking about you, about this." Roy shifted his weight and would not meet Marlowe's eyes the same way he had not met them from his chair on that October night. "It doesn't look right," he said gruffly. "A girl your age living out here like this. People are saying things about us, about what kind of family puts a kid out to freeze." He cleared his throat. "You should come back. Come home." And there it was. Marlowe understood it in the space of a single breath. They had not come because they were sorry. They had not lain awake missing her or grieving the empty room where she used to be. They had come because the town had begun to talk, because a girl surviving alone in the dead house made the people who had thrown her out look like exactly what they were. They wanted her back, not for her sake, but for theirs, to quiet the whispers, to fold the shame back out of sight behind a closed front door. She thought about the warm yellow windows she had walked past on that first terrible night, the families gathered close, the worlds she had no claim to. She thought about every promise she had rehearsed and never gotten to say, while it would have made any difference. "No," Marlowe said. The word came out quiet and clear, and absolutely without anger, which somehow made it land harder than any shout could have. Carol blinked. "Marlowe, be reasonable. You can't possibly want to stay out here. Look at this place." "I am looking at it," Marlowe said. She turned and looked at the house behind her, the crooked, sturdy shape of it against the white field, the smoke rising from the fire she had built with wood she had cut with her own hands. Then she looked back at the two of them, standing there in the cold, the people who had given her shelter without warmth and called it family. This is mine. I bought it. I built it back. Nobody can put me out of it. Her voice did not shake. I don't have anywhere else to go, and that is exactly why I am staying. This place took me in when you wouldn't. I'm not going to turn my back on it the way you turned yours on me. The silence after that was a long and cold one. Roy looked down at the frozen ground. Carol opened her mouth and then closed it again, and whatever she had come prepared to say did not survive the look on her niece's face. After a while, they got back into the car without another word, and they backed it carefully down the rutted road, and Marlowe watched until it disappeared around the bend, and the sound of the engine faded into the wind. She stood alone in the yard for a long time after they were gone. She had thought in the weakest hours of those first nights that an open door back into a warm house was the thing she wanted most in all the world. And here it had been offered to her, and she had closed it herself by her own choice, with her own voice. She had not been thrown out this time. This time she had stayed. And the difference between those two things, between a door shut on you and a door you choose not to walk through, was the difference between a girl the world had abandoned and a girl who had finally, on her own frozen terms, decided where she belonged. That night, the wind howled across the prairie and pressed against the patched walls, and the house creaked and settled and held, and Marlowe lay wrapped in her jacket and let herself think a thought she would not have dared a month before. Maybe this place would not kill her after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was already becoming the one true home she had ever had. But December was coming, and December, out here on the open prairie, did not ask anyone's permission for anything. December arrived without asking permission. It did not drift in gently or send any warning ahead of itself. It came the way the winters always came, out here on the open land, hard and fast and entirely without mercy. One morning Marlowe woke to a silence so deep and so total that it felt wrong, a silence that pressed against her ears like water. No wind whirring the boards, no birds, nothing but a thick and waiting stillness. She pushed open the door she had rebuilt with her own hands and stepped out into a world that had vanished overnight beneath a blanket of white. The snow lay knee-deep across the prairie, smooth and unbroken in every direction, erasing the road and the fence lines and the memory of where one thing ended and another began. The sky hung low and flat, and the color of old iron heavy enough that it seemed it might collapse under its own weight and bury what little the snow had left standing. The cold came at her the instant she stepped outside, sharp enough to steal the breath from her lungs. This was not the kind of cold a person could ignore. This was the kind that watched you, patient and certain, and waited for you to make one small mistake. Marlowe stood in the doorway with her hands shoved deep into her pockets and felt the old fear rise in her chest. Not panic, something quieter and more honest, the kind of fear that asks the hard questions and waits for an answer. Can you really make it through this? Can a girl alone out here survive a winter that buries the whole world in a single night? But the house was different now, and so was she. The tar paper held. The patched walls groaned under the weight pressing against them, but they did not give. The roof sagged beneath its burden of snow, and yet it stayed where she had nailed it, holding the white weight back from her head. She fed the fire slowly and carefully, using only what she could spare, because wood had become precious now, every log, a measured thing, every careless flame, a theft from some colder night still to come. Her routine tightened as the deep winter closed its fists around the land. She woke before dawn when the cold was at its cruelest and forced the circulation back into her stiff hands, stamping her feet, stretching until the deep ache dulled to something she could work through. The big projects were behind her now. Winter work was the work of keeping what she had, clearing the snow from the roof before its weight could pile too heavy and break the back of all her labor, hunting down each new draft and sealing it, fixing the small failures before they could grow into the kind that kill. On the hardest days, the wind came back with a fury that made it feel as though the house might peel itself apart, one plank at a time, and on those days Marlowe sat with her back pressed to the strongest wall and listened to the building creak and shift and settle, learning its voice the way a person learns the breathing of someone they love in the dark. The house talked if you knew how to listen. She had learned how. Then came Christmas Eve. The storm rolled in just before sunset, thick clouds swallowing the last of the gray light and turning the afternoon to premature night. The snow fell heavy and wet, the kind that soaked through cloth in minutes and clung to everything it touched, and by full dark, the world beyond the windows had narrowed to a swirling white nothing, where Marlowe could not see her own hand at arm's length. She worked frantically, in the last of it, clearing the snow from the roof as fast as her burning arms could throw it, until her hands went numb inside their wrappings, and she could no longer feel the shovel. Then she climbed down and stumbled inside and threw her weight against the door to force it shut against the wind that wanted in. She fed the fire. She stripped off her soaked jacket and wrapped herself in the blanket and sat close to the small, steady flames, and for the first time in that long, brutal day, she allowed herself to simply be still. Outside, the storm raged against the walls she had built. The fire popped softly in its ring of creekstones. Shadows moved along the patched logs, and in the warmth and the quiet, she let herself think, just for a moment, of the houses back in town, the windows glowing gold against the dark, the families gathered close around their tables, all the warm, bright things she had long ago stopped letting herself want. Then she saw the light. At first she was certain it was only her tired eyes playing tricks, a trick of the snow catching what little glow escaped her own window. But then it moved, a flicker out in the white dark gone, and then again swaying. Marlowe rose slowly to her feet, her heart climbing into her throat. She crossed to the door and pulled it open, and the wind nearly tore it from her grip. Out in the swirling snow, shapes emerged from the storm. 3 of them, then 4, bent low against the wind and struggling toward the only light for miles. A man with his arm around a woman who could barely stand, a boy stumbling beside them, perhaps 10 years old, and in the woman's arms, a smaller shape, a child terribly and completely still. "Hello!" The man's voice came thin and cracking and desperate across the wind. "Please! Is anyone there? Please!" Marlowe did not stop to think. She ran. The cold bit straight through her socks the instant she crossed the threshold into the snow, but she barely felt it. She reached the man and caught his arm and steadied the woman as her legs buckled beneath her. "Inside!" Marlowe shouted over the storm louder than she had meant to. "Now, all of you, inside!" They stumbled through the door in a rush of snow and wind, and Marlowe threw her body against it and forced it shut behind them, and then she turned to find them collapsing onto the floor of the only room. The woman sank down, shaking so violently she could not speak. The older boy stood frozen near the wall, his eyes huge in a face gone bloodless white. The man went down against the logs with his head in his hands, and the smallest one, the child in the woman's arms, did not move at all. Marlowe dropped to her knees in front of them. "How long?" she said, and her hands were already moving, reaching. "How long has the little one been out in it?" "Hours," the man said, his voice breaking apart. "Our truck slid off the road. We couldn't see anything. We tried to walk to the highway, and we got turned around in the white, and we—" He stopped. His eyes were wild with terror. "He stopped crying. A while ago. He stopped." Marlowe's stomach dropped through the floor. She knew what that meant. She had learned it the hard way in her own first nights in this house in the long, shaking dark when the cold had reached for her, and she had understood for the first time how it kills. It does not come at you roaring. It comes gently. It makes you warm, and it makes you sleepy, and it quiets you, and the crying stops, and that is the most dangerous moment of all. "Get him by the fire," she said, and her voice came out steady and certain in a way that surprised even her. "Not too close. Slow. Wrap him in this." She pushed the blanket into the woman's hands. "Skin against skin if you can. Your warmth, not the fires. The fire's too fast and it'll hurt him. Hold him against you." The woman obeyed instantly, fumbling the small, still boy out of his frozen wrappings and against her own chest. Marlowe moved with a focus she had not known she possessed. She set water near the flames to warm, not hot, never hot. She found her driest cloths and warmed them against her own body and pressed them where the warmth would matter most, the chest, the neck, the small, cold hands. She spoke the whole time low and calm and constant, to the woman, to the child, to herself, the way her own mother's hands had once steadied her shoulders. Without a word, she had learned about the cold, the hardest way a person can learn anything. She had spent whole nights shaking on this very floor, fingers aching, feet gone numb, and she knew the cold's every trick and every lie, and she fought it now with everything those terrible nights had taught her. The minutes stretched out long and thin. The fire popped. The storm screamed against the door. The older boy began very quietly to cry. And then, at last, after a stretch of time that felt to Marlowe like the whole length of the winter, compressed into a single held breath, the smallest child stirred against his mother's chest and let out a weak and broken wail. The sound of it hit Marlowe like a physical blow. The woman dissolved into open sobbing, clutching the crying boy to her, rocking him. The man slid the rest of the way down the wall and wept into his hands without shame, and Marlowe sat back hard on her heels, and she found that she too was shaking now, not from the cold, but from the sheer crushing weight of the thing that had almost happened in her house, and then by some narrow grace had not. This was the house they had called the dead house, the house where a man had once frozen, the cursed wreck that grown men crossed the road to avoid the ruin no one in the whole county would spend $5 to claim. And on this Christmas Eve, in the worst storm of the winter, that same house had reached out its hands and pulled a child back from the very edge the cold had carried him to. The place that had lived in the town's memory as a thing that took life had, in the space of one terrible hour, given it back, and the girl the town had watched and doubted and given a month to fail had been the one to do it. They stayed the night because there was no question of anything else. They stayed the next day too, and the one after that, because the storm had buried the road completely, and the truck sat, half swallowed, in a drift a half-mile off, and there was nowhere on God's earth to go. The woman's name was Susan. The man was Daniel Prescott. The older boy was Wesley, and the small one, the one who had almost not woken, was Silas. They had been driving west toward what they hoped would be a new start, the kind that never seems to come easy when the storm took the road out from under them. Something changed in the house over those days, quietly, the way the most important things change. Laughter came back into it, tentative at first, and then easier, a sound those walls had perhaps never heard in all their long, broken years. Wesley followed Marlowe everywhere, watching her work with open curiosity. "You live here?" he asked her once. "By yourself?" "Yeah," she said. "Aren't you scared?" She thought about the falling board and the killing cold and the long nights when leaving would have been so much easier than staying. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I'm more scared of leaving than I am of staying." That answer seemed to settle something in the boy, and he nodded as though she had told him a great secret. Daniel worked beside her in those days, the two of them shoveling and hauling and chipping ice until their shoulders burned, digging the truck slowly free. On the second night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, he cleared his throat in the firelight. "We don't have much," he said, "but we want to pay you back for what you did." Marlowe stared into the flames. "You don't owe me anything." Susan reached into her bag and brought out a small, worn envelope, the kind people keep for the worst day. "We saved this," she said, "for emergencies." "No," Marlowe said at once, and she meant it. Daniel studied her across the fire for a long moment. "Then what do you need?" he asked. "There must be something." The question caught her off guard. She thought about money, about the long list of things the house still wanted, the lumber and the nails and the food. And then she thought about how this place had felt before these strangers had come stumbling out of the storm. Safe, yes. Hers, yes. But quiet, empty, lonely in a way she had stopped letting herself name. "Tell people," Marlowe said slowly, "when you get where you're going. Tell them this house works, that it isn't cursed, that it held." She looked up at the fire-lit faces around her. "Tell them it can keep somebody alive." Daniel smiled, and his eyes were wet. "That," he said, "we can do." When the family finally left the road, dug out and the truck coughing back to life, they hugged Marlowe goodbye as though she had always belonged to them, and the house felt different again after the sound of their engine faded, not emptier, changed, as though the walls themselves now held the memory of the laughter and the crying and the small boy waking and would never be quite as cold again. The word traveled faster than Marlowe could have imagined. Within a week, people began coming up the dirt road, but not to stare now and not to whisper. They came to leave things. A bundle of firewood set quietly by the door, a sack of potatoes dropped off with hardly a word. A man fixed a broken section of fence down the road and then stayed an hour just to talk. The town that had given her a month to fail had begun slowly and grudgingly, and then all at once to claim her as one of its own. Walt Hendricks drove out, and this time he did not bother with any pretense of an errand. "Heard about Christmas," he said, leaning against his truck in the cold sun. "Heard you pulled a child back from the cold out here." Marlowe shifted uncomfortable, as always with the weight of it. "I just did what anyone would have done." Walt snorted softly. "That's what folks say when they know it isn't true." He walked the perimeter of the house, slowly nodding to himself at the work she had done since he had last seen it. "Town started calling this place the lighthouse," he said, "on account of that lamp you keep burning in the window all night." Marlowe blinked at him. "I just leave it lit so I can find the door in the dark." Walt smiled faintly, the closest thing to a full smile she had seen from him. "Sure you do," he said. He unloaded a crate from the bed of his truck. Glass caught the light, windows used but whole and good. "I don't," Marlowe started, and he raised a hand to cut her off. "You've earned them," he said simply, and that was the end of it. The work of those weeks was no longer the desperate work of survival. It was the patient work of making a home. She fixed a barn door for a gruff old farmer named Frank Dalton, whose door had stuck for years, and when she was done, it swung smooth and shut tight, and Frank stared at it a long moment before he reached into his coat and pressed more money into her hand than she had asked for. "For your time," he said, and at his truck, he paused without looking back. "Most folks twice your age don't work like that," he said, and drove off and left her standing there, holding the money with something warm spreading through her chest that was not pride exactly, but something quieter and steadier. It was the feeling of being trusted. A knock came one evening, and Marlowe still flinched at knocks, the old reflex of a girl who had learned that doors mostly brought bad news. But she opened it to find a woman named Margaret Doyle standing in the cold with her boy Emmett beside her, both of them pale and pinched. Their furnace had failed, Margaret said, twisting her hands, and the repair crews were backed up for days, and the house was already dropping below safe. "I heard," she said, "I heard you might be able to help." Marlowe gathered her tools without a word. She remembered too well the cold creeping up the walls of a house, and she worked in Margaret's freezing basement by lantern light until the furnace coughed and caught and warm air flooded back through the vents. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining. "You have no idea what this means to us," she whispered. But Marlowe did. She knew exactly what it meant. They stopped calling her the girl after that. They started using her name, Marlowe Coleman, the one who fixed things, the one who didn't quit, the one who kept the light on. As the deep winter began at last to loosen its grip, Walt sat at the table she had built, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and he told her there was to be a meeting. The town council had been talking. There was a question, he said carefully, that needed settling once and for all, and it concerned the house. The meeting was held in the same drafty courthouse room where only months before a clerk had brought a gavel down on $5 and changed the course of her life. The room was full this time, and it was there near the end that the last piece of it fell into place. A council member rose, a thin and officious man, and he raised a concern that the property at the end of County Road had been auctioned improperly, that a minor could not lawfully hold such a deed, that perhaps the whole transaction ought to be reviewed and the house reclaimed by the county and the matter quietly tidied away. There were nods, there were murmurs, and Marlowe felt the old cold rise in her again, the cold of a door closing, of a light clicking off behind her in the dark. Then Walt Hendricks stood up. He was not a man who spoke often or easily, and the room went quiet at the sight of him on his feet. He laid a folder on the table in front of the council, the deed and the county records, and the signed and stamped account of the auction itself, every paper in order. The sale had been lawful, he said. The house had been read off that auction list 3 years running, and not one grown man in this county with $5 in his pocket had ever once raised his hand for it. He looked around the room, then slow and deliberate, and he said that the only person who had ever been willing to claim that house was a 14-year-old girl with nothing left in the world but $5 and the refusal to lie down and quit. She had bought it lawfully. She had rebuilt it with her own 2 hands, and on the worst night of this winter, she had used it to pull a child back from death while the rest of them slept warm in their beds. If anyone in this room wanted to take that house away from her now, Walt said, they could be the one to drive out and explain to that child's mother why. The silence in the room was a long one, and then the council members sat down and the matter was settled, not just settled, but turned entirely on its head, because before the meeting ended, the council had voted to recognize her ownership without dispute and then to offer her the town's maintenance work, regular and paid the work of a person the whole community had decided it could rely upon. A 14-year-old girl who had been put out a front door in October with $5 and a backpack walked out of that courthouse in the thaw of early spring as a person her town trusted to keep its broken things standing. Spring did not come all at once. It came in small, hesitant signs, the first drip of melting snow from the eaves, the softening of the ground beneath her boots, the wind losing its killing edge and turning something close to kind. Marlowe stood outside her house one evening and watched the sky fade to soft blues and grays, the lamp glowing steady and warm in the window behind her. A man passed on the road and tipped his hat to her, and she nodded back, and it was a small thing, but it carried the whole weight of everything that had changed. The girl who had once moved through this town like a ghost was not invisible anymore. People saw her now, and more than that, they believed in her. And for the first time in her life, standing in the soft spring dark before the house that $5 had bought, Marlowe Coleman had begun to believe in herself. She built more around that house in the years that came after. A workshop, a wider porch, a place where neighbors gathered when the weather turned hard or life got heavy. And in all the winters of all the years that followed, she never once locked her door against a storm, and she never once let the lamp in the window go dark. When people asked her why, she always answered the same way, because I know what it's like to be out there. Some who toured the place called it a nice story and went away unchanged, but others paused and looked at the crooked, sturdy house standing straight against the prairie and understood. They saw that it had never really been about the money or the luck or even the skill of her two hands. It was about a choice. The choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. The choice to build instead of break. The choice to keep a light burning in the window, not for yourself, but for anyone out there in the dark who might still need it to find their way home.